come to the interesting part. When I started the study 35 years ago, what I did was I got the handwriting of different serial killers, and I wanted to see what was common between all of them. And this is what I found. There's something called the felon's claw. It's in 60 to 70% of all felons. And that's, I'll show you why. Forget about the fact that his name is Gerald. Do you see the felon's claw there? He killed 10 people. Jerry Stano, can you see the claw in the wire? And Gary Ridgway, I mean, these people between them killed over 100 people, almost 100 people. Now, Jeffrey Dahmer, I think you all know about him, he did the same thing with the Jew. And then Dr. Death, you see here, he was a doctor in England. They think he might have killed up to 1,000 patients. And you see that's an enlargement of his handwriting, the felon's claw. Has anybody heard of Charles Albright? Well known as the Texas eyeball killer. He removed the eyes of all his victims. And what did he do? If you look at the wires, they all have that felon's claw. You must have heard of John Wayne Gacy. This I could say this guy, he buried his victims under his own house. And he was married at the time. His wife had no idea. And if you look at the wires, all show the felon's claw. And what is interesting about John Wayne Gacy, you know, people liked him. He actually acted as a clown at the hospital. You remember he was called the Clown Killer? Yeah. And so everybody liked him. He was appreciated. In fact, he was so nice that he was elected the secretary of the Democratic Party in his area. And here's a picture of him with Rosalind Carter. Wow. At that time, he had actually killed 10 people already, and he had been cleared by the FBI and the Secret Service. So you see, we never know, really. John Wilkes Booth. See, I don't know if he killed more than one person. Then there was something else that I found, something called resentment. You see that line at the beginning of every letter? Let's look at this gentleman. I use that term loosely. Ted Bundy. Ted Bundy was infamous mainly because he actually could disguise himself, not intentionally, but people really didn't believe what he was. I mean, he was smooth, he was good looking, and his victims fell prey to that. Look at his handwriting. Look how often he showed the resentment sign. Dorothy, it's your friend again. He also showed the resentment sign. Then there's something else I picked up. When somebody writes cursive in the middle of the word, they use a capital letter like that. The I-5 bandit killed 44 people. Look how often his capital letter went with a cursive. Has anybody heard of Dennis Rader, the BTK killer? No. He killed 10 people. Once again, he used the capitals. Gary Ridgway, the Green Ray killer. Once again, the capitals. This is the most interesting one that I have come across. Many years ago, 3 women, a mother and her 2 daughters, had traveled to Tampa, Florida on a vacation. And when they got there, they stayed in a hotel and they went out driving. They had a car and they got lost. So they stopped at a gas station and they asked this guy for directions. And at the time, we didn't know anything about him except that he obviously wrote down the directions on a piece of paper. Anyway, 3 days later, these 3 women floated up in Tampa Bay. They'd been assaulted and obviously drowned. They didn't know who they were at first, but eventually they did find out who they were. And they actually they found this note in the car, and they knew it wasn't any of the ladies because they had their handwriting tested, so they assumed it belonged to the killer. Okay, so now you know what the killer writes, but how do you find him? Well, this is what the note said here. You see, he used the felon's claw and the capital T. That was in June '89. They were bound and everything. They put the sign up on the board. They didn't know who they were. But then they found their car at the marina. And in the car was that note. Okay? You note the capitals. You note the felon's claw. But they still didn't know who wrote them. So some bright young detective said, why don't we put a sample of the handwriting on a billboard? And they put it on 5 billboards around Tampa Bay. And within minutes, a little old lady, not the same one I met in the front, she actually said, I recognize the handwriting. I've still got the receipt from Ober Chandler. He was a handyman. He did some work for me. And that's actually how they caught him. That's the actual sign they put up there. And the funny thing was, when he was executed 22 years later, he wrote the final statement. You see what he did? He did the capitals again. Because he denied it to the end. That sometimes a simple mistake can solve a crime. Has anybody heard of Robert Durst? Okay, he murdered somebody in Galveston Bay, and he had the dream team. He got off. But he also had a history of getting rid of girlfriends and wives. This was an anonymous letter written by Susan Berman. That was his girlfriend. He wrote an anonymous letter to the Beverly Hills police saying where they could find her, because he didn't want the body to lay there, because he obviously still liked her. Well, it's hard to believe, but anyway. Then they found this letter that Robert Durst had written, and you'll notice that in both cases they spelled Beverly E-Y. And this is going to come up in September. There's a big court case in Los Angeles where that's going to be used as evidence. And also you'll notice that how similar the lettering is. Has anybody heard of Bruno Hauptmann? Do you remember?
He was the Lindbergh.
This was the note, the ransom note. And I'll just show you here. You see the felon's claw? And this is how silly he was. Nobody says murderers are clever, but he signed it BH. That was his nickname, Bruno Hauptmann. And his name was Richard Hauptmann, but his name is Bruno. So that didn't take long. Anyway, they took the handwriting and they compared it, and there it was almost the same. And he was put to death. This is a very interesting one. Ever heard of General Mason? Now, you know the Golden State Killer. I think he's 75. Huh?
Yes.
This guy was 75 as well. And when he was 19 years old, he murdered 2 policemen in California. And they never ever found the perpetrator. And there was a big manhunt for him. They didn't know who he was. The only evidence they had was he had stolen a car, and the cops stopped him, and he actually thought they were looking for something for the murder, because he had assaulted some woman. Anyway, they had the signature, they had the handwriting, not the handwriting, the fingerprint, and they actually, in those days, going back 40, 50 years ago, they never had the facility to be able to identify a fingerprint like they have today. So for many years that became an unsolved crime. They did find the gun that was used, and they got the number of the gun. They found that it had been actually the gun was registered in Shreveport, Louisiana, and it was registered to somebody else George Wilson. Okay, he changed his name. His name wasn't George Wilson, but so they looked for George Wilson, and they couldn't find him. But eventually, when they did identify the fingerprint, they had the writing on the YMCA registration and his writing. The G's were exactly the same.
Fascinating.
Got 2 life terms, age of 75. I don't think he'll see the light today. Patsy Ramsey.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, they suspected her, and to this day nobody really knows. But they asked her, because there was a ransom note, and they asked her to copy the ransom in her handwriting. I don't know if you can see it, but the handwriting, the A's were very similar. So to this day they really don't know, but you can see how similar the writing was. Sadly, she died not long after that. Dennis Rader. How did they find him? He killed 10 people, and then he used to send notes to the newspaper saying, boasting about his murders. And then he got lazy and he decided to put it onto a CD. And he wrote into the police and he said, if somebody, as an anonymous person, he said, if somebody put something on a CD, can you trace it? They said, of course not. Well, actually you can, because that's how they caught him. And this was his handwriting. You see the capital in the middle? Now, you remember before we spoke about somebody being depressed? This is the exact opposite. Frank Sinatra went up. He was an optimist. You know who wrote this letter, Downward Slope? And do you note the capital T, the capital K? This is O.J. Simpson. Okay. You remember I spoke about Donald Trump and the sharp lettering? That's comprehensive thinking. Fast thinking can size up people. Well, that's him. And somebody asked me about small handwriting just now.
Yeah, well, I mentioned it.
Yeah.
About my husband, yeah.
Because her late husband, wrote very small, and this is what it is. They have an ability to shut out everything and concentrate on what they're doing. People who wrote like this were Albert Einstein. You see the small
I
writing?
believe in handwriting analysis.
I want to go back here. Also, what's his name? No, it doesn't matter. This is, people write very tall letters. That's a sign of vanity. And we know he had Botox. Carl, when did you have your surgery?
This is my pure beauty. What are you talking about?
Because he looks good for his age, I must tell you.
That's funny.
Big time ego. That's Cassius Clay. There's Oprah Winfrey. Obama. See the big lettering? That's Tony Robbins.
Yeah.
Somebody who writes with a very big loop at the bottom. They need variety in physical activity to satisfy the insatiable desires and what have you, and it's often associated with people who are sexually motivated. Who do you think wrote that?
Bill Cosby.
Clinton.
That's Bill Clinton. Yeah.
Bill Clinton.
Bill Clinton, yeah.
That was telegraph. Yeah.
Have you ever seen anybody write a very long stroke on top of the T? That's enthusiasm. General Patton, Douglas MacArthur, look how long their T strokes were. Very prominent soldiers. Okay, I've come to the end of my thing, and I'm going to open up the floor to